So now we finally came to the point where we have to start learning how to create something using PHP, since we've learned a lot of things up until now, but we haven't really learned how to put all those things together and actually create something using PHP. The exercise we're going to be doing today is to build a calculator inside the browser so we can actually go in and type into numbers, and then we can perform some kind of operation on those numbers. So we can multiply, plus, minus, divide, those kind of things. So we can actually do something. So as you can see in front of me here, I have a basic index.php file that doesn't really do that much. It's just kind of like a basic setup, so we have something inside the browser. I do have two different style sheets inside my project here. I do have a reset.css and I do also have a main.css file. Now, using these two different style sheets is not something that should be new to anyone in here, because a reset style sheet is something you should know about already, and using a regular style sheet for styling HTML things inside the browser is also something you should know by now. If you don't know how to do CSS, there is of course a HTML and CSS tutorial on my channel, but you shouldn't need it at this point, but it's there if you do need it. I do want to point something out about the CSS though, because I have been told by my subscribers over and over again not to include CSS inside my videos because they're just taking up space. So if you want access to my personal files for these lessons here, for example, for these CSS files, then I do have them available to all the different YouTube members and patrons. So you can just go ahead and click the link in the description if you want to become part of that. With that said, I should also say something else, which I shouldn't really have to say, but I still gotta say it because I keep getting questions about it. CSS has no effect on your PHP code. You can make the calculator in however way you want using CSS, and it's gonna work the exact same way as my calculator with my CSS in here. If you get any sort of errors in this video, it is not because of the CSS. Okay, just so it's said. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk a bit about how to actually create a calculator. So right now we have this basic front page, and what we want to do in here, at least what I want to do with this exercise, is I want to build a calculator and have it run inside the same page, because typically the way we do things is that whenever we want to have any sort of input from a user, we use a HTML form, so we can actually create that now to begin with. So if I go inside my body tag here, I'm going to create a form. Just a basic form, it doesn't have to be fancy. And inside this form, we need to have a action attribute, and we do also need to have a method, since we do need to submit this data and tell it how we want to submit this data. Should it be a get method or a post method? Now, a get method will actually show the data inside the URL when we send this data, because when we send data using forms, we use the URL in order to do so. But using a post method will actually hide the data, so we can't see it inside the URL. And for this exercise here, we're going to go ahead and use a get method just to begin with here, because I do want to demonstrate something once we get a little bit further. So if I were to go in and actually say I want to use a get method, which means we can see the data inside the URL, and then go inside the action here. Now, when I submit this form, I want to stay on the same page, because typically when we submit the data, we send the data to another PHP file, and then we have that file handle the data and do things to it, and then we go back to the front page with some kind of result. However, in this video, I want to just stay on the same page. I want to calculate things inside this same page and just show the data inside the same page here. So the way we're going to do that is we can either leave this action empty, or we can go in and include something called a server superglobal that points to the same page that we're on right now. One of the benefits to doing it this way is if I were to go in and say I want to open up my PHP tags, because we do need to add PHP in order to add a server superglobal, is I can go in here and I can say I want to reference to $_server, and then inside the brackets, I want to reference to PHP_self. And of course a semicolon. So when we do this, it is going to send the data to the same page that we're on right now, so we can do something with the data inside this page here. Now, it is important to note that whenever you want to have anything shown inside the browser using PHP, you want to make sure you escape it using HTML special characters. Otherwise, you can have users that inject code inside your browser, which is not very good. Always think security when it comes to PHP. So inside of here, we're going to go and echo, and we're going to echo out HTML special characters, or just chars with an S behind it, parentheses. And then I want to grab the server superglobal and paste it inside the parentheses. And I don't want to paste in the semicolon. It has to be outside the parentheses. So we have it like this right here. So doing this is going to escape our server super global, so users can't accidentally, people will on purpose try to hurt your website using this particular action here if you don't sanitize the output of your code. There's a couple of different ways you can sanitize data, and it really depends on what purpose it has. Are you trying to output HTML into the website so we actually show something inside the website? Or are you trying to sanitize data submitted by the user, then we use something else? So there is a couple of different ways we sanitize data using PHP. And in this case here, because we're writing HTML that is being output inside the browser, we have to use HTML special characters. Now let's go ahead and make sure that we have everything just jumping down on a new line, because I want to make sure you can see everything so I don't have to scroll sideways like this constantly. So I'm just going to make sure to wrap everything. And I'm going to go and grab the form closing tag, and I'm going to move it down. And inside the form closing tag, we're going to go ahead and include a input, because I want to make sure that the user can actually type in a number that they want to calculate inside this calculator here. So this is going to be a number type. I'm going to include a name attribute, and this one is going to be set to num1. And then I do also want to include a placeholder just so the user knows exactly what to type in. So we're going to say we have a placeholder, and this one could be number 1. Or just something that you think makes sense, so they know what to type in inside this input. The next thing I want to include is not the second number, but I want to include the operators. So in this case here, I could add a select, which is a way for us to create a drop down inside a form. So I can call this one operator, and then I can go inside and delete this ID. Now, just to mention it, since this might be something people are not aware of, but the name attribute inside all these different inputs, so inside the select we have down here and inside the input we have up here, are going to be the name that we have to reference in order to grab this data from the URL after we submit this data here. So just so you know exactly why we have the name input in here. Also, I did not include a label for all these different inputs. Technically, if you want this to be readable and, allow screen readers to perfectly understand what this form is, in order to make usability as good as it can, you should add labels in here. I'll talk about that inside my HTML form episode, inside my HTML course. But in this episode, we're just going to do some basic PHP calculator. We're not going to worry too much about HTML conventions and stuff like that. We're just going to build something using PHP. So inside of here, inside the select, I'm going to add a option. And inside this option, I'm going to go ahead and give it a value, which is going to be add. So we can just say we want to add something here. So inside the option for the symbol, we're going to see inside the browser, I'm going to add a plus, just so we know that this is plus, adding, so to speak. So what I can do is I can copy paste this down and say I want to add a minus, and we can call this one subtract. We could also have called the above one addition, because that is probably how you should say it. Then I'll copy paste it below, and I'll go in and say I want to multiply. And we can also say multiply inside our value, multiply. Then I'm going to paste it down, and I want to say I want to divide in this case here. So divide, and we're going to add a division symbol. And then for the last one down here, we do also need to make sure the user can type in a second number. So we're just going to copy paste our input from up here. So I'm just going to paste it in, and I want to rename everything. So we have name set to number 2. And also I want to set the placeholder to number 2. So now we have everything in terms of input. So we just need to add a button in order to be able to submit this inside the browser. So I'm going to add a button, and I'm just simply going to call this one calculate. So now we have everything that we need in order to have a form that can actually submit data. So if we were to go inside the browser, just so we can see exactly what we have, you can now see that I can type in a number. So I can type 2, and then I can say what kind of operation do I want to perform. So in this case, I could say, do I want to plus, minus, multiply, divide. So I could say minus, and then we can say number 1. So this would actually end up being 1 once we click calculate. But in this case here, it's not going to do anything because we don't actually have any PHP code that does anything inside this thing. So that's going to be the next thing we're going to worry about. Like I said, in this video here, we're just going to focus on doing everything inside the same page here. So below my form, I'm going to go ahead and open up my PHP tags because I want to just add in the PHP here. And in between these PHP tags, the first thing we need to do is we need to actually check, did the user actually submit the form data correctly? Because we don't want to run any PHP code if the user did not submit the form data correctly. So what I'll do is I'll include a if condition, go in here and say inside the parentheses, I want to check for something very specific. So in this case, I want to check for a superglobal called $_server. And I want to check for a certain request method. So I can say I want to check for a request underscore method, which is going to be set equal to a certain method. So in this case, I want to check for a get method. Now we will run into a small issue here, but just for now, let's just leave this as it is. Because as a default, whenever you load up a page inside the browser, it will be as a default set to a get method. So this will run the code no matter what, which is not what we want. We only want to run the code if you actually submitted the form. So technically we do need to go in and actually set this to a post method. And then up here, we do also need to make sure when we submit the data, we submit it as a post method. So go ahead and change these, but don't refresh the browser because I had a point in including a get method. And that is simply that if we were to go inside the URL inside the browser, you can actually see because I did actually try to click calculate one time before we changed all of this. So using a get method, you can see we get all this data inside the URL. So we get number 1 is equal to 2 and operator is equal to subtract and number 2 is equal to 1. So we do get a bunch of data inside the URL. And this is my point about how we submit data, pass it into the URL so we can grab it again and then do something with it. However, when we use a post method, we actually don't see the data inside the URL, even though we do submit it. So if I were to go back in here and actually resubmit everything, so we want to make sure we save everything inside the index file, go back inside and refresh the browser. Now, if I were to go in and type 1, and let's just say 1 + 1, calculate, you can now see that we don't have any sort of data inside the URL. We only have index.php, but there's nothing behind it. So the data is still there, we just don't see it. So the next thing we need to do inside the PHP code after checking for a post submit is that we need to go in and actually grab the data so we can use it for something inside our code. So the way we do that is by going in and say we want to create a variable. I'm just going to call this one number 1. I'm going to set it equal to $_post brackets. And then I want to grab the name of the input that we included inside the HTML form. So in this case here, the first number was called num1. Because if we were to go up here, you can actually see that's what we included inside the name attribute. So going back down, we can include the num1, so we actually grab it. However, even though this is bare minimum for grabbing data from inside a post or a get method, so if it had to be a get method, we would actually do this instead. However, this is not seen as being secure. Let's pretend that right now inside your website, a user goes inside this form and decides to start typing JavaScript code or SQL for injecting into a database or something. Then all of a sudden we have a hacker on the loose that can destroy our website and database and all that stuff, inject malicious code into your site, and we don't want that to happen. You should always sanitize data whenever you have any sort of data submitted by the user, and this is very important to do. You should never trust the users whenever you have anything the user can type something into, because they will try to break your website. We do have a couple of different ways we can sanitize data, either using a filter_var or a filter_input. And in this case, we're just going to go and use input, since that is specifically meant for either post, get, or cookies whenever it comes to sanitizing data from those particular sources. So instead of grabbing the data like this, instead I'm going to use filter_input, parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, we need to include some data. So in this case, I need to tell it what kind of data are we trying to sanitize here. In this case, we're trying to sanitize a post method. So I'm going to say we have a input_post. Then I need to feed it the actual name of the post method that I'm trying to sanitize. So in this case here, it is called num1. We do need to make sure this is inside a string, by the way. And then we need to tell it how we want to sanitize it, like what kind of method do we want to sanitize it with. In this case here, I want to make sure we sanitize a float, because when you go inside this calculator here, you can go in and type a float number, so you can write a decimal point. So what I'll do is I'll go in here and tell it that we have a filter_sanitize. You can actually see we get a bunch of options popping up here. The one I'm looking for is sanitize_number_float. So that's the one I'm going to paste in here. So just to show it here, if I were to zoom out, it is going to look like this on one line. Okay, it might be a little bit small for you to see, but this is how it's going to look like. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the second number. So I'm going to copy everything here and paste it below. And the first thing I'm going to do is change the variable name. So now we're grabbing the second number, and then I want to go in and grab the number that had a num2 set to the name attribute inside the form. Now, when it comes to the next one here, which is the operator, we do actually need to do things slightly different, because if I were to go in here and actually say I want to grab the operator, so we can say we have a operator name that we want to grab. If I were to go in and actually say I want to sanitize a string, because this is actually a string data type that we're submitting with the plus, minus, multiply, divide icons here, it is actually giving us a small error message. It is saying that filter sanitize string is depreciated, which means that it is no longer recommended that you use it inside your code. And this is actually something new that came with PHP 8, because if you were to go inside the documentation, inside PHP's website, you can actually see that they don't recommend that you use this anymore, because there's a little bit confusion about exactly what you're trying to do with this method here. So instead, they do actually recommend that you use HTML special characters instead of using this particular filter input here. So if I were to go in, I can actually go ahead and just delete everything and say I have this HTML special characters. And then I want to go in and actually just grab the post superglobal and reference to the operator name and simply do this. Of course, we do also need to change the variable name, so we want to make sure we say operator, just to make sure this is also changed. I know this looks quite confusing in like multiple lines like this, but if I were to zoom out, you can see this is like how it would look like when it's not looking messy and confusing. So now that we grabbed the data and sanitized it, the next thing we need to do is we need to run something called error handlers, because error handlers is a way for us to go in and actually try to prevent the user from doing things they're not supposed to. Let's say, for example, I go inside the browser here and leave one of these inputs empty. So I go down and I leave the first one empty and I try to submit this. Then you can see, oh, it got submitted. But we don't want that to happen, because then that means that things are going to go wrong. There's nothing to calculate in here. So what we need to do here is make sure that the user has to type something into both of these inputs here. And I can already feel people typing comments now, because some people will tell me that, Daniel, you can just go inside the form inputs and add the required attribute, then people cannot submit the form. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go inside the first input here and let's add a required attribute at the end here. And let's go ahead and do that for the second one as well. So we're going to go down to number 2 and we're also going to paste it in down there. So now technically we cannot go inside this form and submit it without typing something, right? So if we were to go inside the browser, refresh it, just go ahead and say yes to continue the submission. And if I were to try and submit this without typing anything, oh, we get this little pop-up. It says, please fill out this field. And clearly, no matter how many times I click it, it is not going to submit. So this is security, right? We are now preventing people from submitting. I clearly have a point here, in case you couldn't tell. So if I were to go inside the browser and you just know a little bit about browsers, what you can do is you can right click inside the input, inspect, go inside this little developer tool, go in and actually delete the required attributes. So I can actually go ahead and delete this one, and I can also go in and delete the second one. So I'm just going to click enter, close it down, and now I can actually submit it. So this is not going to be a valid way of trying to not submit the form without filling in inputs. Always use PHP for security. Don't do any sort of security with front-end languages like HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. In the case of JavaScript, you can do it if you're using it as a server-side language, but don't do it if it's a front-end language, okay? Always do security using a server language. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back down to my code, and I want to start including some error handlers. We can actually write a comment here just so we know exactly what we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and type error handlers. So I know exactly what this code does. We can also copy this comment here, go above and say grab data. So we know exactly what this does here. So let's go ahead and add from inputs, just to be precise. Now, when it comes to error handlers, we can pretty much come up with as many things as we want. So for example, I could say I want to check for empty inputs because that should not be allowed. I could also check for a maximum number of decimal points, or if they didn't type in a number, but instead typed in a letter on the keyboard. So we can check for many different things. The first thing we're going to do inside this error handler here is create a boolean, because I want to actually have a boolean that tells me, is there any errors happening inside my error handlers here? So what I can do is I can say we have a boolean called errors, and I'm going to set this one equal to false. Because right now there's no errors happening inside this code here. So for now, it is just going to stay as false. But if we were to go down and say, you know what, let's go ahead and check if the user left any inputs empty. What I can do is I can run a if condition. And inside this condition here, I can say I'm going to use a function built into PHP called empty. And basically what this one does is that it allows for me to paste in a variable. So for example, number 1, and it is going to tell me whether or not this variable has no data inside of it. So right now, if the user did actually submit something inside number 1, so they typed something inside the first input here, then it will actually have data inside of it. But if they left it empty, then it's not going to have any sort of data. So if this one is empty, or because we learned about this operator in the previous episode, if number 2 is also empty, or because we have a third thing from the user, which is our operator. So I also want to check if the operator is empty, then run some error code inside the curly brackets. The first thing I want to do is I want to output a message inside the browser. So I want to actually paste in this little piece of text that I have here. So just a basic echo where we echo out a string, which is going to be a piece of text called fill in all fields. And then I simply wrapped some paragraph tags around it. The paragraph tags are only there because I wanted to style my error message inside the browser so it actually turned red so people could actually see it. But you can style this in however way you want to inside your CSS file. After doing this, I want to go down to the next line, and I want to make sure that we now set our errors equal to true, because now we do actually have an error. So this should be true. And this is basically all we have to do right here. So what I can do now is I can check for a second error message. The second one we're going to check for here is going to be whether or not the number submitted is actually a number or is it a letter. Because if someone were to go in here right now, you can, oh, I actually managed to. Again, this kind of proves that even though you go inside your form up here and you say that, oh, it has to be a number, sometimes it doesn't quite work because I can't type letters in here, but clearly I just did. So it didn't quite catch it when I clicked on my keyboard. Also, you can right click, inspect, go in, autofill it with a value or something. Again, don't use HTML for security, okay? It's not going to be enough. I have absolutely no idea why it actually typed something in here. But it proves my point, so I'm kind of happy it happened. So what I'll do is I'll go down and I want to create another if condition. So I want to say I have a if condition. And inside this condition, I want to check for something called isNumeric. So I can actually go and run a built-in function called isNumeric. And then I'm just going to go and paste in our number 1. Then I want to include a or, and then I also want to check for number 2. Remember, we're only checking numbers right now, so we don't need to have the operator included in here. But something else we do also need to pay attention to here is that right now I'm checking, are these numbers? And if so, then run a error message. And that's not really what we're trying to check for here. We want to check if these are not numbers, right? So either I can go in and say, is this equal to false? Then do something. Or we can do it the professional way and go in and just write a exclamation mark in front of isNumeric, because this is checking, is this false? And the same thing, of course, we need to do to the second one over here. So right now, if these are not numbers, then run a error message inside this condition here. So I'll just go ahead and copy paste what we have up here, and I'll change the message. So instead of fill in all fields, I'll instead say only write numbers, and paste that in instead. At this point here, you can include as many error handlers as you want to have inside your code. I'm just going to go ahead and leave this for now. Otherwise, this is going to be a very long episode. So let's just go ahead and include these 2 error handlers here and say that's okay for now. So after checking for errors, I want to go down and I'm going to create another comment. And I want to say calculate the numbers if no errors. Then what I want to do is I want to run a if condition. And I want to go in and say, if there were no errors, then run this calculation inside the curly brackets. So the way we do that is, again, by checking if errors up here is equal to false. Because if it's equal to false, then it means we had no errors because we didn't change it further down. So now we actually want to run the calculation. So if errors is equal to false, by adding the exclamation mark in front of it. After doing this, we want to go inside the curly brackets and we want to actually check what kind of operation we need to do here. Did the user want to plus or minus or multiply or divide? We don't really know. So we need to run a switch statement in order to determine what exactly they submitted. So going in here, we can create a switch. Say we want to add a pair of parentheses, curly brackets. And inside the switch condition, I'm going to go ahead and say we want to include the operator because the operator is going to decide what exactly we're doing with these numbers here. So I'm going to paste it in because that is the one I'm looking for. And inside, we're going to go ahead and include a couple of different cases. So I want to say case number 1 is going to be if we have a string that is equal to add. Then we add a colon and then we add a break just for now. Then in between these two, we want to actually add in what is supposed to happen. So in this case, we want to actually add the two numbers together. So what I'll do is I'll say that we have a variable called value that we're creating right now. And I want to set this one equal to variable number 1 plus variable number 2, semicolon. And this right here is going to be the first calculation that we do inside this switch statement. So now we just copy paste it. Because we have a couple more, we have 3 more we need to paste in. So we'll paste in like so. And then we're just going to go ahead and change the cases. So right now we have subtract, and then we also have multiply, and we have divide. And just to mention it here, these strings here are what we typed in inside of the options inside the form. So if we were to go up inside the form, you can see that these are the ones that we included in here. So that's the one that we actually refer to inside these cases down here. Now we do also need to make sure we change the operation. So this is going to be minus, this is going to be multiply, and the last one is going to be divide. And we do also want to add in a default because if something happens and something goes wrong and we don't actually have any sort of data inside the operator or something, it could happen. Something might happen. Okay, so you have to think about everything here. What could go wrong at some point? So let's go ahead and include a default, which is going to be an echo. And this echo is simply going to echo out a error message. I'm just going to copy paste what we have up here, paste it in, and then I'm just going to say something went wrong. Something went horribly wrong, just to be a little bit dramatic here. So now the last thing we need to do in order for this to technically work is to go after the switch statement and actually output the calculation that we just calculated here. So what I'll do is I'll go below here and say we want to echo. And I want to echo out a string, which is going to be a paragraph because I want to actually have this styled inside my browser. So I'm going to close off the paragraph as well. Then I also want to go in and add a class because I do actually want to style my text inside the browser. So I'm going to say I have a class, and now something is going to happen. And you may have noticed this on the previous echoes up here, because if I were to go in, because typically when we have a class that equal to something, we need to have double quotes, right? However, if I were to do that, we're actually canceling out the surrounding string double quotes. So we can't really do that. If we were to try and write something in here, you can see, oh, that is not working out. It's actually giving me an error message. So something we need to talk about here is the use of single quotes, because you can either use a single or a double quote for example, creating a string. So I can actually go ahead and do this instead. So we just use a single quote, or we can use a double quote. And the same thing goes for HTML. You can either use double quotes or you can use single quotes. And by using single quotes and mixing it together with double quotes, we don't cancel out the string, so to speak. So I can actually go inside my class and I can say I have a class name set to calc-results. And in this simple sense, we now have something that works. Okay, so we're not canceling out anything here. So inside the string, I want to output result is equal to space. Then I do actually want to add in my value, which is right now up here. So we have a value variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to concatenate things. So we could actually, just so it's a little bit easier for you to understand, go in here and delete the last ending paragraph tag. And after the double quote, I'm going to concatenate my variable. And then again, I want to concatenate a string because we need to close off the paragraph. So I'll go ahead and say we have a closing paragraph and do something like this. So now at this point here, this is technically going to work. However, there is going to be something slightly off about this code here. Let's say this switch statement here gets run, and the default case down here is the one that is actually being used because something goes wrong and we don't actually run any of these cases up here. What is going to happen is we're going to get an error message because variable value is never created. We don't actually create it inside the default value down here, so we don't actually have it when we reference to it inside the echo down here. So it's going to output a error message. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right before the switch statement and I'm going to declare the variable so we have it no matter what. So we don't get an error message inside the browser. And now typically we would be able to just go in and declare the variable like I just did here. So we just have a variable, but we don't actually assign any sort of data to it. However, in some cases, that is actually going to throw a error message for some people. It is not actually going to work. It's going to have a reference error or something. So what we want to make sure we do here is we want to actually assign something to it as a default, which is going to be 0. The reason I'm adding 0 is because this is going to be a number or a float that has to be assigned to this value here. So this is going to be a float data type that is assigned to value once we actually start doing those calculations down there. We did talk about this in a previous episode where we talked about data types. So we create variables that don't actually have any sort of data assigned to it. And the fact that this is not something we should do inside PHP because in some cases it is actually going to throw an error message. So we do need to make sure we assign a default value to a variable inside PHP. Again, we can keep adding to this project here, but for now, this is going to be okay. So we just want to declare the variable before the switch and everything should be okay. So having saved this, let's actually go ahead and test this out inside the browser. So if I were to go inside my browser and type in number 1, actually we need to refresh everything first, so that is important. Don't worry about those error messages. Those are only there because I went into the developer tool previously and deleted the required attributes. So don't worry about those right now. All the changes we made to the code will take effect now as we click the next time on the calculate button. Okay, so don't worry about those error messages right now. So going inside, I can go in and say 2 plus 2 is going to be equal to 4. So it's working, yay! But now if I were to go inside the form and try to submit it without having any sort of data typed into, let's say, the first one up here, then we're going to get a, well, first of all, please fill out this field. But if we were to go in and actually remove the required attributes, you can see we're going to get our error messages. So in this kind of way, we can create a cool calculator inside our website using all sorts of PHP code that we've learned up until now. So I can actually go in, let's go ahead and test out multiply. So we can say 10 times 2 is going to be 20. So we can do a bunch of different calculations and just kind of like experiment with it and try out what we just created together here. So with that, this is how we can build a calculator using PHP. I hope you enjoyed this lesson here because this is a stepping stone to learning PHP. This is the moment where people are going to go and say, oh, that's pretty awesome. Now we have hope that we can actually learn PHP and do something inside websites with it. Hey, so this is a pretty big moment, I think, when it comes to learning PHP. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed and I'll see you guys in the next video.